Hello. Very quickly, like many of you, I watched that close to 4-hour HH Bomber video on plagiarism back around the end of 2023. It was a good watch, and I found some new channels on my way out too. But I also couldn't help but get into this small state of panic wondering if I've ever stolen something from a video myself. In which case, I'd like to point out the Drowned Tome made by Usco13. This document is basically a collection of all the stories found in the skill tree of the game, made concise and in sequential order. It is also where the namesake of this series is derived from. Drowned Tome, Journey in a Bottle. Get it? Anyway, this isn't to say I stole anything from the Drowned Tome, as I made doubly sure not to even glance at Osco's interpretation of the lore as I was making my own. However, as I began to think more and more about that HH Bomber video, I started to realize that it wasn't just about plagiarism. It was about community. And yeah, I do apologize. I know stuff like this is typically placed at the end of the 30-minute video, but it would feel disingenuous to me if I put something as important as this in an addended section, as an afterthought. Because before I watched that video, I was much more focused on just me. But afterwards, and in very simple terms, I found that we're all giants. From Osco13 painstakingly going over the stories in a game's skill tree, and there's a lot, to then place them into a Google Doc for everyone to look through at their leisure, from me picking apart said Google Doc, going over the game world multiple times and turning that experience into a comprehensive cinematic for YouTube, and finally to you watching said video and potentially making your own interpretations from it. We're giants. All of us. Standing over one another, reaching even greater heights together. So, once again, special thanks to Osco13 from Reddit for making the Drowned Tome, and a very special thank you to Cartographer's Quill, also on Reddit, for making this cool map of the 8 Kingdoms and giving me permission to both edit and use it in this video. I would also like to acknowledge the crew of the Sultan Sanctuary Wiki, not just Fextra Life, but mostly these guys over on Google. I didn't know you can do that. But hosted by Lemon and brought together by them and theirs. Again, thank you, all of you. And as usual to you, viewer, I hope you enjoyed this video, an amalgamation of effort by the giants of the Sultan Sanctuary community, and the result of passion transcending throughout the years. Many Saltborn inhabit this island, and not just the drowned who walk its corners aimlessly, but those with the glint that remains in their eyes still. Each with their own faces and stories that help piece together the lost secrets and veiled truths hidden within its crevices. And the biggest of those pieces were found in their words. Words from a knight with no master. Words from a crestfallen thief. And words from a very curious sorcerer. The knight speaks of questing, having the simple philosophy that we must explore to discover, and that we must succeed to survive. That we are defined through our adversities. Do you ever wonder where these buildings came from? Who built this castle? Does it have a master? The thief speaks of her avarice and her expertise in satiating it, but in the end, that very greed is what led her here of all places. And like many, she looks for a way out. You know what I found? I found the brand on his neck. They don't put brands on the necks of noblemen. And finally, the sorcerer asks, is this a dream? Definitively, no. But close. He would continue, we were to make peace with the citadel of fire and sky. Kulka'as' sitting king had just announced an alliance with Ascaria, and with it, allegiance to their new gods. The climate for sorcerer collectors would surely sour, so we sailed. But there was a storm at sea. I was washed ashore. I don't think any of my fellow sorcerers survived. When I found this ziggurat, I thought I'd gone mad. But I'm no stranger to dark magic. Imagine a demon that feeds off the ruins of nations. A demon that collects. Such a powerful being could dwell on this island. Perhaps this island is the demon. And it feeds, claiming men, women, kings, countries. This sorcerer, like many others, like many things on this island, is a remnant of history, evident by how he describes the very prominent faith of Ascaria as new. And yet, he seems to have much more of a grasp on this purgatory than others. How? Does the knowledge of dark magic truly give that much insight onto the world? Well, let's take a step back with the story. A story outside this island for one, and a story that even this sorcerer couldn't return home to hear himself, following the tragic fate of Kulka'as' then sitting king. Incidentally, the group of sorcerers that this one comes from are known as the Black Sands Collective, and was found by Mina the Traveler. She was originally a keeper of fire and sky, but set out, centuries ago, towards the southern continent in order to find a second citadel. Unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the collective of sorcerers she did create took on a new form altogether. In doing so, this departure from the citadel is what created the bad blood between these two groups. Regardless, they established themselves in their new home, studying its unique magic. Once the alliance between Kulka'as and Ascaria was announced, however, the Black Sands Collective knew they would have to confront their sister order in Livin much sooner rather than later, and thus was the grounds for the sorcerer's mission, to broker peace. The sitting king he spoke of, Kuan Yin, was known as the Sun King of Kulka'as, ruler of a very prosperous nation. After his allegiance to Ascaria's new gods, his kingdom was blessed and unrivaled when it came to its annual bounty, though that bounty came with ruin as well. Before his nation was known for its prosperity, Kulka'as was plagued by a very unique and unknown disease, seemingly from out of nowhere. This blight took the lives of many citizens as well as his older brother, Tom Yin. The death of his brother filled the king with grief, but led him to create his life's greatest work. You may know the Sun King now as the Dried King of the Ziggurat of Dust, and the ziggurat he created was to be the tomb for all those who fell to this mysterious blight. The Black Sand Sorcerer asked to investigate the ziggurat further, and deep within his forgotten desk of the king's Magnum Opus, we find indisputable proof to the sorcerer's claims. Though Odingus aimed with collecting nations, every abomination that has been damned to hell, and every secret that has been lost to the depths of the ocean may be found here. We find Kuan Yin's brother, or rather something else entirely, his corpse, defiled and tampered with long before it arrived on the island. The creature built itself from the earth, becoming colossal in size and animated by clay. The others whose lives were also taken during that period of disease were met with the same fate. Tamin, this bloodless prince, made them in his image, housing 3 faces to better allow the new gods to bestow their wisdom onto him. The Sun King relied on the enlightenment his brother provided and did whatever he said without question, though not with faith. Whispers of this sacrilege, this unholy communion, rose in the kingdom, whispers that eventually led the Sun King into madness. He lived his twilight years in paranoia, his secrets dying with him in the end. Until now, anyway. It's not uncommon for the gods to take a hand in the fate of mortals, be it Devar who shepherds lost souls and stewards saints alike, the will of dead heroes delivering their kin to victory, or various old gods who simply watch over their devoted. The 3 in particular have been intertwined with royalty since its conception, and their machinations are merely the surface of the arcane's influence, because very much like the realm it resides in, magic is truly infinite, yielding power through understanding as well as understanding through power. Unfortunately, however, it's a cycle that's a bit too efficient, because the moment one questions magic is the moment they question law. Understanding one ultimately gives insight to the other, and that's not knowledge just anyone can endure. To fully understand the mechanics of the island and the dark forces at work, one must first understand the fundamentals of magic, the very weave of fire and sky, the will of the world itself. The earliest days of weaving the arcane came in the form of parlor tricks. Traveling magicians and performers alike would conjure flames and embers to excite their crowds. Eventually, those more capable thought to seek and bring out this medium's full potential, and this led to the art of channeling. Specifically, this art is using a catalyst or some form of conduit to focus in the energy from fire and sky, then unleashing it. While some innate understanding of the weave is needed, the art itself is rather simple with straightforward requirements. The first of the 2 rules is that this catalyst must be in the shape of a rod, while arcanists can only use such or wands to do so. Second is that it needs to possess the necessary runes. You're more familiar with this in the form of brands, burning these symbols of power on the flesh to give readily access to the abilities they hold, or something far less savory. But this is only the first step. The next are incantations. While channeling yields a more precision-based effect by design, incantation-based spellweaving is to wield the raw powers of fire and sky itself. Because of that innate understanding I mentioned earlier takes even more precedent. Weaving the arcane, in layman terms, is a feeling. No one, regardless of talent or knowledge, can cast magic without being properly initiated, and that initiation is only gained through understanding, sometimes enlightenment. To quote a fledgling mage in their experience to this awakening, A warm peace fell upon me. It was something I never felt before and would never feel again. It was like 1,000 bright and chiming bells became voices, each one whispering to me. I felt as if something ethereal was softly brushing against the tips of my fingers. Like a sea of feathers, I calmly felt the weave, touched it, embraced it, wrapped myself in it. We'll come back to this story later, but to express this further, as well as to reiterate, the weave is all around us, permeating all things. Truthfully, it is fire and fire alone that holds this power. Sky is merely the realm in which divine fire exists. However, fire and sky are intertwined. The former, like an ethereal fabric tangled within the latter. Without sky, there is no fire. With sky, there is always fire. And drawing from this ethereal fabric, giving it form, structure, and purpose, is the essence of magic. In magic, whatever you may call it, the arcane or fire and sky is simply a law of nature, something that cannot be denied. As it happens, however, even what is law is known to skirt the rules every now and again. Throughout history, arcanists have discovered other skies as well. For instance, it was Ganwar the Filthy who found the Sky of Bog, bringing magic to the forest. He recorded many poisonous spells and incantations and archived them all, though encrypted, in the Codex Maleficent. While the home of the forest is living, I do think it's safe to say this was done after the three colonized the eastern continent and took place instead in the west. The specifics, I believe, are important as the locations of these skies heavily influence the corporal world, while also explaining some geographical consistencies and abnormalities. One of the biggest abnormalities from the western continent, actually, whose origins still remain a mystery, is grey rot. For the West Continent was home to many herbs, many poisons, and many diseases as well. This disease was so prominent, it enlisted a tale to accompany at least one of its tragedies. This was the tale of Vel Karam, a witch and an almost romantic poem. In summary, it conveyed the story of a Justinian knight by the name of Egri who hunted down the witch and eventually slew her. It was believed she was the source of the spreading blight, one that not only rotted the flesh, but the mind, leading all afflicted into a mad frenzy, attacking everyone in sight. In the end, however, she wasn't the source, merely the only thing keeping it at bay. And once she fell, it only grew worse, spreading more rapidly. Egri spent the rest of his years hunting down the children of El Karam, while telling the world of her story. The truth. And this was only one of its tragedies, as grey rot was never alleviated from the continents. It would resurface itself time and time again, affecting every community differently. On this island, in the Myra Stench, a bit of land taken from the Gulchmar of the western continent, are victims who possess this affliction still, even in after death. The leprous, as they're called, did not survive this blight either. There's some bit of confusion that expresses otherwise, but that is simply not the case. To reiterate, in vain attempts, they tried to appoint godhood to some creature or other to garner their salvation. As it happens, it was the gods Gebel and Axgal who, while not curing the disease, offered respite to those afflicted by dousing them in gold and cleansing them with wine. The gold wasn't to be treated as wealth, but more so as a symbol, an ideal even, wearing it as flesh to be reminded that though their body is poor and failing, their spirit will yet remain rich with life and splendor. The other gift from Axgal was as pragmatic as it was ceremonial. Wine wasn't a conduit for the arcane, not exactly, meaning its purpose wasn't to channel energy from the sky, but after sharing his wisdom, Gebel spoke to their followers of the warp and its connection to wine, that it was a celestial field from which magic can be drawn or strengthened, and that connection grows deeper with the consumption of it. With this newfound perspective, those afflicted were given new life, and this group was reborn as the House of Splendor, Creed to Gebel and Axgal, the Fool and the Prophet respectively. Needless to say, there was something magical or enthralling about the arcane. What first started as a simple means for entertainment eventually became the spark for the pursuit of knowledge and the understanding of the ethereal world. But the ethereal is never too far away. The barrier between it and the corporeal is delicately thin, and that awareness is what allows arcanists to harness the powers of magic to begin with. Knowing the weave permeates all is one thing, but truly feeling it was the key, and that feeling captivated many. So of course the very practice of it resonated with many scholars and mages alike, enough for them to create some common ground for their curious minds to pursue it despite their constant warring homelands. It was this fascination that birthed the Keepers, that led to the Collective, and would inspire yet another group still. Livin was the home of worship as much as it was the home of Inquisition. Sometime after the Citadel was founded, and before the time of Mina the Traveler, a handful of Keepers departed from the Order to follow their own research, away from the regulations. Unfortunately, very few remember them, despite how much they influenced the arcane world. And curiously, they wouldn't often wield magic themselves, but were more competent in the arcane than their sister orders. They weaved it more practically, and it became something of a science. Despite their titles having an air of menace to them and how their own agenda, capturing and destroying dangerous monsters, saved scores of lives outright, they were primarily researchers, and the research they conducted became the very foundations of alchemy. These were the Bloodbrows of Livin. As a side note, assuming that their name was made to their discretion, it expresses that they valued blood, an element that doubles as a vestige or shadow of life, so to speak. Intentional or not though, it's still good insight into how they operated, especially in their main craft. Alchemy is an art of life, giving an old life for a new one, and like magic has its own rules. There are 4 things needed for alchemy to take place. The first is the original, the framework or foundation for the transmutation, or quite simply what the alchemy is being performed on. Next, an ingredient, a remnant or dreg of the life or memory that will determine the result. Third is the catalyst, what drives the reaction, and finally, salt, what gives the reaction power. Alchemy was once a dead art, presumably due to the extinction of the unspeakable, beings who were the only ones powerful enough to provide the catalyst for most transmutations. And as this island tends to re-earth what was once forgotten, it had inadvertently breathed new life into it. But alchemy, while being the most prominent form of weaving the arcane into objects, there are of course other crafts of the weave. For instance, alchemy and blacksmithing share many parallels, though I don't know for sure which craft came first, as either is possible. In one case, the complexity or eventual depth of alchemy became simplified to only require an ingredient, the dreg of life or memory, or the latter becoming the groundwork for the former. Regardless, unlike the case of alchemy, which alters the original, blacksmithing merely reinforces it. In both cases, these require memories, though they differ again in the aspect that alchemy requires a specified ingredient, whereas in blacksmithing it must be generalized. A memory is strong enough to hold one, but not enough to recall it. And typically, this would have to be a memory of war also, though it is possible that those memories of war could just have great affinity with the process, rather than being an actual requirement itself. But the last of these crafts is artisanry, for lack of a better word, or the creation of trinkets, often rings and charms. And out of all of them, trinkets are what I find to be the most peculiar, as the crafting of rings in one aspect is more or less traditional. With the mastersmiths of Markdor and Ascaria, as well as the powerful minerals and ores that simply exist in the world, it's not such a far-fetched idea of craftsmen being able to infuse magic into such trinkets, or reinforce them with something such as star quartz or a crystallized sky to create various effects. Rather, it's an almost natural, expected feat to accomplish. Charms, however, are far more mundane, typically done by finding bits and pieces then putting them together. To be specific, finding a charm that yields some magical boon, and regardless of how powerful or weak that boon is, because of sophisticated artisanship, is pretty understandable. A pale charm, for instance, has runes on it that translates as grass to be on, promising its carrier just a bit more reach. There's also the Impin's charm, which is adorned with the crest of its Kraken namesake, bestowing its carrier with the strength of fire. Charms like these qualify for the very first and second rule of channeling magic. Even still, charms that are made directly from mythical creatures are also pretty straightforward when it comes to understanding where their powers originate. However, when you look at a trinket such as a bloodflower charm, which isn't even made by blood flowers really, but painted in their dye, you'll know that it yields very real power. Yet it is only tied to a superstition, and one that is rather recent in the history of the 8 Kingdoms actually. So, how and why does making a charm with paint essentially create this effect? Well, what is superstition if not a common, collective belief? One of a higher power, and not so different than ideals or the religions of people. And what are people without such ideals, without their beliefs? The moment you question magic is the moment you question law. Understanding one ultimately gives insight onto the other, and that's not knowledge just anyone can endure. Most can't. Have you ever questioned the way craftsmen harness the powers of memories, smiths emboldening their weapons and armors with salt, or alchemists swaggering about the very essences of life to mold reality into something closer to what they find ideal? Isn't it all a bit too familiar? There are but 2 requirements for a catalyst to channel the arcane: to be rod-like in shape, and to possess the necessary runes. Given that Saltborn may harness the power of brands, this would mean they meet both requirements, though I believe the very first is a widely regarded misconception. Not that it needs to be in the shape of a rod, but in the shape of a limb. specifically one that resembles the Tree of Life. In that sense, Saltborn are very much like every other creature that resides in the continents. Their furs may be used to make trinkets, just the very same as their blood and their leather. Because just like the Candlelit, sprites and spirits, and just like the gods, the Kraken, and every other hateless creature, the Saltborn, mankind, are just another part of this order. But not just order found in the sky which houses fire, nor just an order found in life, the source of fire and what supports the sky, but order in the sea, what mirrors the truth. As a mirror, true power is found in salt, which bathes in the seas of the ocean. And as Saltborn, they may harness this power to bolster their own, or become something else entirely. As Saltborn, they mirror fire and resemble life. As Saltborn, they are the consequence when the sea mimics the laws of the sky. Just the very same that the continents may hold many skies, there is a blot in this world where the sky does not reach, where it is pitch black. I believe this blot is somewhere intersecting Caden, Ascaria, and Kulka'as, meaning the traveler potentially even naming her collective after witnessing such a phenomenon herself, what led the Black Sands Collective to take on a form all its own. Studying this enigma, an embodiment if not the essence of dark magic, the Emrian Sea. Dark magic as a whole is something of an umbrella term, and to define it, there's no need to look elsewhere but deep within the records of the Citadel, where the Keepers hid notes of magic with no need for fire or sky, where the natural weave was replaced by the shadow of man. That shadow came in many forms, but they were often vestiges of the dead if not the living. So in this way, dark magic could be defined as any manipulation of the weave that uses Saltborn as its conduit in place of the sky. And in this way, the many crafts we've been discussing could be categorized as such also, though such labels in this instance could only be reductive towards the meaning we're looking to find. The Black Sands Collective definitely studied the uses of dark magic, but I don't believe they actively partook, at the very least not in any meaningful, detrimental way, which could be said for most. And I'd say that distinction is what ultimately separates them, because while in many ways, yes, the indulgence of these practices are inherently parasitic, that is also simply life. The dead provides for the living, as the living understands that they too will have others partake in their vestiges, eventually. In other words, it's a law of nature that just barely skirts the rules. In the same way that love could easily be malformed into lust, or how the inherent instinct to survive, present in all living creatures, could devolve itself into gluttony, even petty greed through acts of discipline and virtue can wear the same face as ambition and purpose. It is the overindulgence of such practices that will foster malice, sacrilege, and so much worse. With one final story, let's discuss the latter, the absolute worst of what's capable of dark magic and its practitioners. Let's discuss the horror of Foley Knoll. On one of the Bloodbrow expeditions, they were sent to hunt down Gnarlins, and they were some of the most vicious and abominable creatures the forest had ever seen. No one could gather how such monsters could even come to be, and yet everyone knew the terrors in their shrieks and the paralyzing horrors of the creature's face. A misshaped and grotesque thing hidden in what was almost infant-like, being so innocent, and yet so out of place. They were a defilement of life itself. On the accounts of the surviving Bloodbrow, her group, despite being well trained, made the careless and fatal mistake of hunting them too early. They were picked off one by one as night approached the horizon. The Bloodbrows were utterly powerless to anticipate where the creatures would descend from, as the Gnarlins stalked their prey from their evergreen roosts above the treetops, cradles to their diurnal slumber. In her words, they were too quick, too shapeless, too evasive in the veil of night, yet somehow she managed an escape, just barely, by locking herself inside a forlorn cabin. And to her surprise, that cabin was already occupied by Ascarian locals. They welcomed her though, at first. They offered drink, shelter, and respite, but halfway into the glass she was given, she was already slipping unconscious. The next image the survivor awoke to was that of multiple silhouettes in the middle of a grand banquet. Bound and stripped of her armor and weapons, she came to, seeing that the dining hall was strewn with butchered human corpses, one of which she saw possessed the very same tattoo of her now late comrade. She watched in disgust as these cannibals, this cult, committed the ultimate act of sacrilege on her fellow Bloodbrows. And as the hooded figures were beginning to taunt and close in on her, she did the only thing she could have done. She prayed. It was Devara and Ayadel who took her audience. They allowed her an escape, granting the defiant Bloodbrow the ability to understand and use the weave of fire and sky. With divine flames granted by 1,000 chiming bells, she removed her bindings and began setting their encampment ablaze. She sought justice and retribution, and in her quest for utter destruction, she eventually came across one cultist who was expecting. The Bloodbrows shared a slight reluctance to strike, though ultimately, that decision didn't fall on her. The cultist lunged first, and the Bloodbrow merely defended herself. She gave the encampment no mercy, recoiling only in heart though not in action. And through the rest of that night, with many slain bodies littering the forest of Livin, the presence of blood and smoke filling the air were made palpable. It wasn't until the very end of her crusade that she finally stumbled upon the nursery of the camp. And it was so innocent, and yet so out of place. Quote, "What I had to do that day should have made me a monster, but the facts remain. I returned to Livin with a cart that carried 6 healthy yet premature infants, and but those 6 I left not a single soul alive at Foley Knoll. It is my sincerest prayer that the lives I saved do not bear the curses of their ancestors." End quote. After this Bloodbrow survived the horrors of that cult, the flames of Foley Knoll would spread for miles and last for days, killing every sleeping gnarling within the trees of its ashen forest. There wasn't much good that came from this event, aside from those potential lives saved, the complete eradication of such monsters, and the answer to that gnawing mystery. Before, it was only a rumor that gnarlings were accidentally created by forest tribes placing their stillborn children within the trunk of a knotted tree, and the dark magic that transformed them was a mere unfortunate coincidence. But now, we know the conception of such abominations were deliberate, and the work of that Ascarian cult. And it's no coincidence that Ascaria, the epicenter of war and trade, the neighbor to Inquisition and divinity, the home of the new gods, are often the culprit in such matters. Though just this once, I don't believe the blame of this atrocity falls entirely upon the 3, alone. And despite the lack of concrete evidence, I'd say I can guess the name of this cult as well. It could only be a cult comprised of the damned, the shunned, and the hopeless, who, for whatever reason, clung to any idea of salvation they could find. What happens when a soul becomes so twisted by knowledge and power that even Devara can forgive their transgressions? Well, the only path left for souls like that, ones who have sunken far past redemption, is even further down below. I mean to speak of the Creed of Osridak, brother to Devara, a creed of apostates, the Order of the Betrayer. If you can recall, Osridak was from the old pantheon, the god of bloodletting more specifically. An addendum, he's also one who's committed the ultimate betrayal. For what that betrayal was, I do not know, but it sparked a following of the familiar spirited. Those who wanted blood from their enemies praised the Osridak who gave them the power to take it, and in exchange gave their blood to him in turn. Though understand that this group isn't particularly novel, for each and every one of them was once part of a different order. They congregated, bringing with them secrets, knowledge, loyalty, and whatever else they stole from their former creed before becoming apostates. One of the most prominent of those secrets were those hidden records from the Citadel I mentioned earlier, of a forbidden magic that made a particularly old adage most true. Quite simply, blood for blood. It is expressed by the mage of this creed on how they were casted out of the Keepers of Fire and Sky for wanting to study this dark lore. Yet under the sanctuary of Azradak, they are allowed to wield the shadow of man without consequence. Those of this creed simply covet the idea of belonging, as the payment for their salvation from their god was to simply continue spreading chaos and despair, so that their Dark Lord's return may be expedited. And others came to this creed for a somewhat opposite reason, knowing that the new gods didn't have a place in their world either, as they realized that the idols coveted en masse by the world over can only be described as a work of fiction. I informed you already on the crusades of King Raylan the Bear and the lineage shared with his descendants, a lineage of conquest that eventually found the Creed of the 3. and it was this creed that became the most widespread among the 8 kingdoms. In contrast, during the times of Devara, the goddess of kindness, grace, and light, though it may not have been perfect, the continents were more akin to peace. But in the era of the new gods, a period found by war, the result is a world that has known war for centuries. And the Order of the Betrayer is a byproduct of that, and yet the least of the 8 kingdoms' troubles. Because beyond good and evil, there is one truth that persists. The Saltborn are to find sanctuary, to yearn salvation. But I've had your ear for long enough, and it'll be a while before our next meeting. So I'll leave you with a question for the time that remains in between. What do you believe holds the greatest power in the 8 kingdoms, in this world? Think on it. Ponder it. Though I believe I've given you plenty to think on already. Golly Gee Willikers, he did it again. After first conceptualizing this lore series back in late 2017, 3 videos from a discontinued lore through, and taking 5 years to make the first part, look at me, growing as a person. It only took me 2 years for this follow-up. On a more serious note, thank you all for your patience. I already expressed the reason for my inconsistencies, and now I am back in school once again for my final year before obtaining my bachelor's degree and being in an unspeakably deep amount of debt. Anyway, besides all that, Journey in a Ball is now about 2/3 the way done. The next part will be the final part, but obviously don't expect that for a while. And then afterwards, I will go out of my way to express the lore in a more layman terms, straight-laced manner. I will at least begin to work on the script for the finale, so that when I eventually have the time to make it, it won't take me as long. Also, I do hope the people who started following because of that one meme video have come to both understand and come to terms with the uncategorical type of content creator that I am on YouTube. Basically, I do want to make more video essays, but don't subscribe to me if you only want or expect me to make video essays. I have a lot of interests, and my channel is going to reflect that. So subscribe to me if you think I'm a cool guy. You can like the video though, in case you forgot. I assume you enjoyed the video if you made it all the way here. But it won't be too long before I upload something else because I've been putting some videos on the back burner to focus on this, but I will let this video rock on my channel for a while so I can ride the high. Otherwise, until next time. Peace.